Robert Jenson was a Lutheran theologian, American Lutheran theologian, who died in 2017. He wrote a number of books that came out of his studies with and about Karl Barth's theology. He wrote on ecumenical concerns. He wrote a book on sacraments called Visible Words. He wrote cultural essays, and his final achievement was a 2-volume systematic theology that was published in the late 90s, I think. But Jensen has become one of my favorite theologians for a variety of reasons, and particularly his systematic theology is one of the books that sticks in my brain, although other books of Jensen stick in my head, and little quips and statements of Jensen stick in my head. One of the reasons for reading Jensen is just the pleasure of reading his prose. He is a very pithy writer, where you read somebody like Karl Barth or many Christian theologians, you wish they had had an editor, that somebody had tightened up their prose a little bit. You have the opposite impression, the opposite response to Robert Jenson's work, because Jensen is sometimes so pithy that he leaves much unsaid that you wish that he would have said something. But he is not just pithy, not just concise, but witty in the way that he expresses himself. Let me read a few quotations that are characteristic of his work. Theology is thinking what to say to be saying the gospel. So the gospel is the center, the gospel is the standard of all our theology. And so theology is about thinking how to say something about whatever, as long as we're saying the gospel. At the end of the first volume of his systematic theology, which is about the Trinity, he says, God is a great fugue. There is nothing so capacious as a fugue. At several places when he talks about the eschatological resolution of all things, he says the end is music, or the final transformation of creation is into one vast implosion of love. Or God is not a something, however rarefied or immaterial, but a goings-on, a sequentially palpable event, like a kiss or a train wreck. I came across a video clip of Jensen lecturing recently where he talked about his early work being focused on Lutheran scholastics, and he loved the Lutheran scholastics. He studied the Lutheran scholastics until he realized that the Bible was interesting, and he started devoting himself to more biblical theology. My favorite line, I think, from any book review I've ever read in a theological journal is a review by Jensen of some, I don't remember what the book is, but he says something like, this book represents where Karl Barth might have ended up if he had not cared anything about the Bible. So I commend Jensen just for the pleasure of reading Jensen, but also some of his characteristic insights I think are really beneficial. He talks a lot about what he calls the identity of God. The Triune Identity is one of his early books, a book of Trinitarian theology, and then the first volume of his systematic theology covers some of the same ground but more elaborately. But when he talks about a triune identity, part of what he's talking about is the need to identify God by name. And he invites us to imagine living in the first century. We're living in a world where there is no generic God. We can't talk about God because there are dozens or even hundreds of gods around. If you talk about God as a Christian, you have to identify the God that you're talking about. And the way that Christians identify the God they were talking about was by using his name, which is Father, Son, and Spirit. Jensen formulates this by saying, God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, having first brought Israel out of Egypt. So God is identified by name, God is identified with particular events in history, and that's essential for identifying God in a pluralistic culture. One of Jensen's books is called Unbaptized God, and that's something that he's against. He doesn't think we should speak in generic terms about God or deity, but we should talk about Father, Son, and Spirit. And he insists in that book and elsewhere that Father, Son, and Spirit is a name. It's not a description of what God does. And so it can't be molded and changed, because we find it offensive that there are two masculine names in the name of God. It is a proper name, and that's the name that we use to address God and call upon God. From those considerations, it's clear that for for Jensen, for Christianity, as Jensen points out, for Christianity, God is not immune to time. God's relation to time is a huge issue in Jensen's theology, maybe the major issue. And when you say God is whoever raised Jesus from the dead, then you're identifying God not as the eternal deathless one, but you're identifying God with something that happened. You're identifying him by something that happened in time and in history. And that means that there's a unique relationship in Christianity, or in biblical religion, you could say, between God and history that you don't find in other religions. In fact, Jensen characterizes religion in general as being the belief that God is immune to time, that God is estranged from time. Christianity is the opposite. God is timely, God is timeful, and God has time for us, to use a Barthian formulation. Jensen even pushes this to the ontological Trinity. There's a kind of temporal structure to the life of God. Time moves from past through present to the future. There's an origin, there's a present time, there's a destination. And he sees the same kind of structure within the triune life. There is a whence, something from which is the Father. There's a whither, something toward which is the Spirit. That is the life of God, and that's irreducibly the life of God. You can't eliminate that whence and whither and still be talking about the God of the Bible or the God of Christian confession. So that broadens out into what Jensen says is the big project of Christian theology, which he describes as revisionary metaphysics. Christian theologians in the early centuries inherited concepts and categories and ways of argument from Plato and Aristotle and various convergences of Plato and Aristotle and Neoplatonism. And they made use of all those categories, but they made use of all those categories in trying to describe the God of the Bible who does not fit into those categories. And so in formulating Trinitarian theology and formulating Christology, they necessarily revised the inherited metaphysics that they got from the Greeks. So Jensen doesn't think that what's happening in the early church is Hellenization, the gospel being overtaken and overwhelmed and captured by Hellenism. Thinks the opposite is going on. It's Hellenism being revised by the gospel. But Jensen doesn't think that project is over. It was partially achieved in the early centuries. It's further achieved by medieval theologians. There's advances in the Reformation and there's advances in the modern world. Jensen thinks that's an ongoing project for the Christian church. We're constantly testing our inherited philosophical, metaphysical, and cultural assumptions by the gospel, and we test and revise that inheritance by the gospel so that we can do theology, which is thinking what it is to say when we're saying the gospel. So revisionary metaphysics, that category has been, I think, that part of Jensen sticks in my brain as an aspiration for much of my theology work. Insofar as I dabble in metaphysics and philosophy, what I'm trying to do is look at those philosophical categories from the perspective of the gospel, evaluate and judge them from the perspective of the gospel, and revise them so that they fit what the Bible says about God and his work in the world.